So, welcome to the Fewer Capes, More Tea, a British and Irish comics panel at Thought Bubble 2020, which is an online event this year. So we're not all crammed into one location, catching each other's normal colds and drinking far too much and talking ourselves hoarse. It is wonderful to welcome our esteemed panel, which includes Mary Safro.
Hiya.
Dave Gibbons. Declan Shalvey, Woodrow Phoenix, and Rachael Stott. Wonderful, everybody is here. So the idea of this panel is it's discussion on the history and current comics culture in Britain and Ireland. And we'll touch on superheroes, or lack thereof, the tight-knit communities that build up around comics, where the comics can have a uniquely national flavour, or whether as the internet has changed the way that people consume and make comics, whether we've got much more of an international flavour than we did before. Dave, I'm going to start off with you, and because your career spans a degree of time.
Thank you, young man.
And what I'm interested in is the fact that so much of your work has been superheroes, when quite often people don't necessarily think of superheroes as being a British thing. And whether you recall there being a particularly British flavour to the industry back when you started, you know, before things like Watchmen, before you moved to America.
Yeah, I think there's always been a particular kind of English feel about comics. I mean, paradoxically, the reason that I'm in comics, or one of the things that helped me get into comics, was the fact that not many British artists knew how to draw superheroes. So when 2000 AD was casting about for somebody to draw the Harlem Heroes, which was essentially people flying through space, they tried a lot of British and a lot of European artists, and they couldn't quite get it. They couldn't give it that superheroic feel. But I'd grown up reading, amongst other things, superhero comics. So I was immediately, despite many deficiencies in my drawing, to give it a kind of superhero feel. So that kind of got me into comics. But I must say that in later life, really, superhero comics haven't been my main interest. I think I sort of liked them a lot when I was a kid, and then I sort of graduated to science fiction comics. I loved a lot of science fiction comics growing up, and of course 2000 AD is a science fiction comic. So that really was always the thing for me. And again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of British comics weren't actually drawn by British people anyway, so they always had a kind of cosmopolitan feeling. The thing about this panel that I'm intrigued about, because I'm kind of showing my ignorance, but I didn't know there was, is there such a thing as Irish comics?
How dare you?
I mean, as a distinct flavour of comics.
I'm going on the record saying Dave Gibbons is a scumbag. No,
I'm asking. I'm not saying. I'm asking.
No, I think
my ignorance.
No, I don't. It's. I think that it's more of a recent thing, and that's kind of. I mean, when I was starting out, I mean, my introduction into professionally into comics was actually through the British small press, because there wasn't anything in Ireland, nothing I was aware of. And it was around that time there was more people doing indie work. But in the last 10 years, I mean, I think I could name 20, 30 people from Ireland who are working in comics doing different types, be it superheroes, graphic novels. I think what's kind of slightly where it's lacking is maybe Irish material by Irish creators with Irish content. Whereas for the first few years was probably more, you know, Irish people working in the American market or the British market. So I would say it's a relatively recent thing, in that it's kind of come into its own maybe in the last 5 to 7 years, maybe. I don't know, maybe I'm biased because I'm from here. And maybe Mike, would you have a better idea?
Yeah, I think so. It's one thing that's interesting for me is that so many people like yourself and like Will Sliney and Nick Roach, the people who've been coming out of Ireland in sort of the last 10, 15 years, have gravitated towards superhero comics, to American comics, without going through the British scene, as it were, which basically 2000 AD.
Well, there was Killian Plunkett and Dermot Power originally,
yes,
but they kind of just disappeared into more lucrative fields, I guess. But I'd say I was definitely raised by American superhero comics. That's kind of what I really read growing up. But also we had the benefit of seeing things like 2000 AD and Commando, so we kind of got it from both places. But so it's weird. It's like it's born from the same culture as British comics, but I think, say, like I would count Garth Ennis, but I mean, I don't know if Garth would call himself Irish or British. So that's
very definitely British.
He would say British, would he? Oh, traitor. But I mean, but when I reread his work when I was younger, it really resonated with me and like the culture I'm from in a way that, say, more British centric stuff did. So I think it's born from British comics, but is becoming its own thing.
Woodrow, I'm interested in your perspective here, because your work is something that has reached outside of what an awful lot of people in comics think of the mainstream, but is kind of niche comics. What do you feel about British comic culture? Does it have its own voice?
That's a really tough question to answer, because I don't really think of comics as being this monolithic thing. I think of comics as being a whole bunch of different interests that all intersect and join up. And some of those bits are very, what you might call mainstream, as in the same kind of things that American readers look at, superhero stuff and science fiction stuff and fantasy stuff. And then there's all the stuff that isn't like that at all. I mean, I think the word mainstream, even though I introduced that topic myself, is not a great way to describe what we look at, because it only really applies to superhero comics. And there's a whole bunch of other things that are not that. And I think the tradition of humour in British comics is probably the thing that makes them so distinctive in a way. Every country has their own, funny comics, but I think ours are a particular kind of, they span a lot of interests, and a lot of people who wouldn't think of themselves as comics readers, who like human comics and will read them, because they just like funny jokes. And the way that I approach working on any kind of story is that, although I'm a comics creator and comics are the thing that I love to make because I think comics have a unique way of doing things, I don't think about the medium itself. I think about what it is I want to do with it. So I try not to necessarily think about making stuff for comics readers. I just want to make something interesting, and people who like comics will enjoy reading that, and people who don't think about comics as being their thing might want to read it too because it's about a subject that they like. If that's not a convoluted way to explain what it is that I make.
No, that's fascinating, because you're with a lot of the stuff that you do, you're drawing on, and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of Japanese culture, and things like manga. And do you think that produces a kind of hybrid?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, that's what we're good at. We're good at looking at all kinds of sources and then transforming those things into things that we're interested in. I think everyone here has done that to some extent. We draw our influences from all the things that we like, whether that is Japanese comics or French comics or Italian comics or American comics. It's just all material. There are all these drawing styles. There are all these ways of looking at the world, and they're all interesting. And we can use bits of those things to create the thing that we like, that means something to us. And I think it's great to be able to feel that you've got that freedom to do that. You're not constrained by, a house style that is imposed on you by an editorial team. It's just, what do you want to draw? What do you want to make? And I think British creators in particular are quite good at subverting those things. I mean, that's what Dave's been doing, forever. It's like he's absorbed all these things from around the world, and then he's made them into his own. And there's always that slight attitude to what we make, I think.
Oh, well, if not that I'm so much of an outsider, but I think stuff that I noticed with, like, when there was more British creators was, I mean, I think the British invasion that's referred to all the time was, I think, maybe an added sardonic wit or a cynicism or a, a lot of the content seemed to be very, say again, we're going to use terms that may or may not apply, but say like mainstream American comics. And when British creators got their huge spotlight, it seemed to be that there was just a different take on the source material that hadn't been happening for a while. But I mean, this is all in retrospect, looking back. I mean, I think maybe Dave would have a better idea.
It's a question of perspective. I think we, coming from England, saw things in American comics that the people who'd grown up steeped in American comics just didn't see anymore. They didn't see the basic kind of strangeness of it. A thing that, I mean, I've done some of that, but a writer like Grant Morrison, who's a Scot, I mean, he did stuff with superhero comics that was just amazing because he identified the basic oddness of them, the basic strange set of rules. So I think distance from the source is always important. And I was also going to say that I think there's something about people like Garth Ennis or Scottish writers I can think of that they're a certain way away from the hub of comics in the British Isles, which was London, I guess. And so whenever you would go to Ireland or you go to Scotland, you'd meet people who were so pleased to see you as a British comics creator because they didn't get to see the people who made their comics. And so I think the distance, both from the point of view of being a creator and being a fan, has a huge influence on the kind of things that you're attracted to. Does that make sense? I don't know.
No, definitely. And I'll stop talking because I won't otherwise. But I remember like seeing that Garth was from the north. That gave me, as a kid from the west of Ireland, I was like, oh well, if he can. Or same with John McCrae, was like, these guys are doing like American comics like that. If they can do it, maybe I could. And I know in the years since I started working professionally, I've been told by other creators who've started and now have a professional career that seeing guys like me or Will and Stephen Mooney work professionally and go like, well, those guys live down the road. Like it provides an accessibility or things where you kind of dismiss as fantasies or things you could never really achieve all of a sudden become a lot more close.
It shows you that it can be done. You don't know quite how you're going to do it, but you know it's doable. But, yeah.
Was it really a big influence on you to know where things came from? Because if I think about the stuff that I read as a child, it was from all over the place. There were French comics and American comics and British comics and Japanese comics, and it didn't really matter that they weren't from here. It's like I didn't make that distinction. They were just all interesting in their own weird way. And it didn't make me think that there was a particular kind of national idea about it. I mean, it's partly because I don't think in Britain we have so much emphasis on this is British, whereas American comics are very much about Americanness all the time. It's an American thing that they do to talk about themselves
I was just
like that way.
fascinated by America growing up. It seemed this impossible, distant kind of Babylon, that was just this kind of fantasy place where all the people dressed better, they had better food, they had better movies, the cars looked great. So I always had that kind of provincial attraction to the center of what I perceived to be the cultural empire or something like that.
And similarly with Ireland, I mean, it was America and Britain or the two empires either side of us. So nothing really. And also, I would say I wasn't really raised in a culture that like taught you to try hard or try to do something. I come from a culture that's like, don't try. Why bother trying? Keep your head down. Don't follow your dreams. Get a proper job. So anything that was exciting always never came. Not never, but like generally came from Britain or America. So it was always seen as something kind of different.
So now all of us feel very sorry for Declan.
Of course, poor Declan.
But Mary,
you're not from, where I'm from.
Well, I would like to come to you, Mary, because your perspective, I think, it plugs in very nicely to that topic of conversation. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your experience with comics and how how you were inspired? What inspired you to start comics?
So where I grew up in Latvia, we didn't really have comics. The only comic I read when I was a kid was Mickey Mouse and like Disney stuff. And this is it. When I was older, I tried to find superhero stuff to read, but you couldn't buy it. was really hard to pirate, and it was really hard to, just be in the loop with this stuff. So in the end, I ended up pivoting to manga and indie comics and webcomics and stuff that was basically easier to find online, until I was old enough to actually buy comics and move to the UK and such. I think my biggest inspiration was Jamie Hewlett and Tank Girl. But basically anything Jamie Hewlett did, I was just loving it. And yeah, that was a lot of manga and stuff, because it showed me that there are other comics, that comics can be about anything. It doesn't have to be superheroes. It doesn't have to be set in America. It can be about sports. It can be about romance. It can be about just general slice of life. And to me, the indie side of comics was always more appealing because it was more relatable, I think.
And with the kind of comics that you do, do you feel that you are making comics with a Latvian voice, or is it like we were talking with Woodrow, a hybrid voice, of you being online, living in the UK, and writing about Latvia?
I definitely agree with Woodrow about comics being this individual thing, that all voices are different, and when I approach my comics, I don't think about what country I live in. I think about what I want to write and my personal experiences. I do think that living in the UK actually made me care about my culture more, because when I moved here, I tried to avoid anyone from my country, anyone who spoke Russian. I tried to avoid that and just adapt as well as I could. And when I was starting to make my comic strip, Drugs and Wires, initially it was just a parody of cyberpunk stuff. I would take on the tropes that were, present in The Matrix and Neuromancer, and I would use that. And once I started working on a longer story with my collaborator, we decided to move it to this post-Soviet country, just because then it would be even more miserable and funny. And I found myself, reevaluating my culture as someone who's almost like an outsider, and I found this really interesting.
And with webcomics, you kind of get away from the monopolies that exist within the mainstream. There it is again, but within the print comics industry. Does that give you a even greater degree of freedom just to tell the story that you want to tell?
Oh, absolutely. I think this is why webcomics has such a large variety, and there's a lot more LGBT stuff, and there's a lot more diversity in webcomics, precisely because there's no gatekeeping. You don't even have to make a website these days. There's Webtoon and Tapas, which are apps where you can just upload your work and you just need to draw it, basically. It's as simple as that. Well, it's not simple, but you don't need to find a publisher. But it does mean that you need to wear a lot of hats. You need to do a lot of marketing, and you need to be good at yelling about your comic online 24/7. So it's not ideal for every creator.
Which isn't very British or Irish.
I suppose not, but there's quite a few successful webcomics coming out of the UK, like Withershins, that's been going on for 8 years now. And then there's Finding Home and Inhibit, which are all doing really well on Webtoon and winning awards.
Rachel, I want to come to you to get your perspective on this. Because one thing that has always struck me about your work is that even when you're dealing with figures and characters that are traditional comic book characters, there's a European flavour to your stuff, which I think sets it apart. Is it a case of, like Woodrow was saying, that it's a distillation of different cultural comic books from different cultures and art from different cultures?
I think for me, it's kind of like, I always see myself as sort of probably the last thing to come out of that sort of very British, like the whole 2000 AD and Marvel UK vibe. Like, I mean, I'm saying last, like there's probably people past me with the same style, but my art style has ended up being this weird amalgamation of like all the books I was reading growing up, which were like Silver Age, proper superhero cape books. And then also like a bunch of British stuff, and there was like loads of artists like, I don't know, basically same as Woodrow. I was like, I'll just steal his answer. It's an amalgamation, but yeah.
I think you can't help it though, because if you have any kind of enthusiasm for comics and what you make, you're going to have all these things that inspire you, and they're going to come out in you.
Yeah.
I mean, what I see in your work, Rachael, is that there's a quite a glamorous thing to the way that you draw. I mean, everyone looks really attractive, and there's a really beautiful kind of design sense that I think of as being something that you do that feels like it adds a certain extra kind of stylishness to your comics that isn't typical of superhero stuff.
It always makes me think of, I saw there's like an interview with Frank Miller, and he was like, I'm not interested in pretty. I don't care if something's pretty. And I was watching that as a kid, like, I like pretty. Pretty's okay. Frank Miller wouldn't like me.
Frank likes pretty. Frank likes pretty. But it's just that his idea of pretty is pretty.
It's not like it's more like ooh. But
So I was just going to say, like, something to straddle the middle of kind of both conversations is like, as an artist, like, I never wanted to be an Irish artist. I wanted to be an artist who was from Ireland. And I don't think anybody would look at like my art and go, oh, he must be from wherever. I think there was certainly a kind of not a house style, but a kind of something, if something looked 2000 AD, people would assume it's British or European. And I think there was a lot of people who were kind of like coming, who were inspired by Dave specifically, who looked a bit like Dave, and you could tell that they were, British. But when I started writing work, I felt, having had been in kind of American comics and done all like, Deadpool or Venom and all these different things, I wanted to make something that was more representative of home. I don't know if you've ever seen the film The Snapper. It's from the 90s, but it's a story about a working class family where the daughter gets pregnant, which was very socially like not okay at the time. And I remember rewatching, going, I've never read a comic like this, like something that felt, from like I grew up in an estate. There wasn't my experience, but like there was a lot that like I remember from my childhood, and it just bothered me that I'd never read a comic like that. So I wanted to make it. So weirdly, the most Irish stuff I've made is the stuff that I've written and not drawn. Whereas my career of being an artist has been very much, Marvel, DC, Image type stuff. It's kind of weird. Maybe I felt like a fraud and I needed to improve myself somehow. But it is interesting. It's similar to what Mary had said, that I lived in America for a little while, I lived in Scotland. So being away from Ireland made me think a lot differently about the culture I was from, because when you grow up in it, maybe you're not aware of it. But then once you plant yourself in a different culture, all of a sudden you're observing the one you're in and you're thinking about the one you're from.
I was really struck when I went to Dublin for the first time by how it didn't feel European at all. It felt like something else. I mean, it didn't feel like England. Like when you walk around England or when you go around the UK, you expect everything looks kind of the same. And Dublin felt very different. I mean, there were phone boxes where you could phone the US directly, weren't there? And things like this. And it was like, there wasn't that much
phone boxes.
It was weird.
Yeah, well,
much more American than English.
If you go from Dublin to Belfast, you can even see the change. Like there's a lot more. Empire is much more present in the architecture.
I think that there is inevitably an internationalization of comics, because I think, for a start, no one nation can actually afford to have a comic book industry of its own. I think, economically speaking, it's just not possible. So I think the tendency is to go and work for other markets, and then it becomes one big market where it's got all these different departments that are accessible to everybody, no matter where they physically live. I mean, there obviously were Japanese comics in the 1950s and 60s when I was growing up, but there was no way in which I ever would have been able to access them, because for a start, I wouldn't know that they were there. And then, unless I had a pen pal in Tokyo or something, it would just be impossible. Whereas now it's all laid out on the table, and no matter where you're from, you can home in on anything you like. So I think that's the way things are going. And I think that's great, because people are exposed to a huge diversity of approaches and kind of character.
Do you think sometimes people can fool themselves into thinking that there is a particularly unique character to a nation's comics? Because I'm thinking about, you know, when we're talking about the 2000 AD style, and as David has pointed out, so many of the artists who worked on 2000 AD in the early days weren't even British. You know, you got Carlos Esquerra, you got Ramon Sola, Jose Ortiz, who is the most British artist in terms of style that you can imagine. Do you think that it can sometimes be a bit of parochialism, that people convince themselves there's something special about the way that they do comics that other people don't?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we all do comics in our own special way, you know, but yeah, I think you may be right that it's not actually truly tied to national boundaries, you know.
It might be a lot more to do with the writing, because when you were saying about English people coming in and rewriting like American characters, like it's such a stereotypical and like pre-internet thing of Americans are full of optimism and sunshine, and so it was that kind of like, that's what superheroes were, and then suddenly these British creators were coming in and being like, oh, but maybe they're sad occasionally and stuff. And so yeah, and so like I think it's more to do with like the British sensibility through the writing rather than the artwork so much. I might be wrong.
No, I mean, I think it's true. I think even with the British invasion, people speak more about the writers than they do the artists. And plenty of artists broke in at the same time. It's you know, it's a different conversation, but like, you know, the voice tends to be like whoever the writers. Plus, also writers were generating more material at the time as well. But I think we can fool ourselves. Like Dave said, he wasn't even aware there were Irish comics, and I wouldn't be one to say that like we don't have an industry by any means. I think there's one publisher in Ireland who publishes comics, and it's more like Irish interest graphic novels. I think the difference is I felt like when I went to England or to Britain, there was the Dandy, the Beano, 2000 AD. Like, you guys actually have an industry. Yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, actually. Sorry.
Were there ever any indigenous Irish comics, you know, like the Beano and the Dandy? I've always thought of as being Scottish comics because it's very much that kind of Scottish worldview, and even their own kind of more personalised, like the Bruins. I don't know if you're familiar with the Bruins, which is sometimes almost an impenetrable kind of Scottish cultural thing. Was there ever anything like that in Ireland? Did it have an industry?
Nothing beyond small press. Like there's definitely kind of movements. Whereas I think the first Irish comic to be accepted by Diamond was a friend of mine, Bob Byrne, did these really crazy gonzo type comics with a really authentic voice. But like it's basically tended to been a small press scene that's been building and building and building, with some people, you know, taking off out of small press. But now as regards like published material, no, it just, like, culturally, I'm sure we all could say in Brit, you know, comics only go so far as regards, you know, mainstream British culture would accept. And we have that added problem on top of that. You know, we have a literary history of James Joyce and all this, but I think there's always been more of an appreciation of prose over visual art, which is something we've always kind of, I feel we still are battling against.
One thing I did want to ask about was, and it kind of plugs into what you were saying, Declan, about a sense of home, a sense of place, of that whole thing about, you know, returning home after being away and knowing the place for the first time. Mary, I want to talk to you about this and about expressions of kind of cultural currency in comics. That how do you feel the way that you make comics is engaging with not just your perceptions of the world around you, but also your memories of the place that you're writing about?
Well, I do actually have to do a lot of research for my comic, because a lot of stuff I thought I remember actually didn't, because I was like 10 when the 90s happened. Yeah. So yeah, it definitely helped me learn a lot more about, you know, the country I'm from, and, you know, the country where my parents are from. My mother is from Russia. I ended up watching all these documentaries on, you know, the perestroika and how they Soviet Union fell and how people lived in the 90s, because I feel like my family maybe didn't tell me all of this stuff, because we had it fairly well where I lived. But yes, some people led really rough lives in the 90s, because there was this cult of America, and there was this promise that, you know, now that we're westernizing, everything's going to be better. But also there was this dreadful poverty. And yeah, I got to learn a lot about that just by doing research and working on my comic. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Well, because I wanted to explore a little bit about comics that were about somewhere, and because Declan, you've done Bog Bodies, which is a true crime set in Ireland.
Not true crime, but like kind of.
Sorry.
Loosely, yeah, no, they're all. I mean, it's all loosely based on real stuff. But like you said, I've been, you know, the better I've done my career. Weirdly, I'm looking back more. Like there's something I'd like to do, which is kind of IRA based, and I've just been doing so much research, like similar to what Mary's saying, like so much stuff underneath, scratching under your own history, and there's all these layers and layers that, like, as a kid, like I was saying, I was looking at America and looking at the UK because, like I tell people from like America that I used to work in a castle, like a legit like 800-year-old castle, and they'll look at me like I'm insane. But when I was growing up, it was so boring. You know, it's just
there's castles everywhere in Ireland. Everywhere we go in Ireland, there's a castle.
Yeah, it's littered with the place, all over the place. So you don't see that as interesting. But then I remember when I went to America, and they appreciated their own history so much, as in, you know, from the birth of the state, and it's only like what, a couple hundred years, but they really appreciated all these little landmarks. And I realized, you know, a country as old as Ireland had such long history that I was completely ignorant of, totally not interested in. So it kind of, it made me want to, especially loving comics and having done so as well as I have in comics, it made me feel like I wanted to put some of that into, because, you know, Moon Knight doesn't have anything to do with Ireland, and I also don't want to shoehorn stuff in that doesn't need to be there. But, you know, I remember reading things like Dave's The Originals, which is, you know, it's science fiction, but it was loaded with so much kind of like, you know, Britpop sensibility, or old school Britpop sensibilities, and it feels more like a British comic, even though it's completely sci-fi. And I like the idea of making more books that are representative. You know, they don't have to be crime or whatever, but it's weird how much I'm looking backwards now rather than looking forwards.
I don't think it's necessarily backwards. I think for all of us, okay, maybe you have to say what you think. We start off wanting to make things just like the things that we loved when we were kids, which tend to be foreign. And then, you know, as time passes, we start to think about doing things that actually mean something to us. And that means doing things that are based around our lives and the things that we experience every day. And that means doing stuff that's about where you live, you know, and not about some imaginary place that's 3,000 miles away. So maybe I think it's just that, actually.
And there is a richness and subtlety in things that you've understood all your life. You know, there are things that you can pretend to be an American writer, but you're never really going to be an American writer. And it goes beyond the spelling, you know?
I guess that's the thing about what is commonplace to you is exotic to somebody else. So, you know, plenty of people, as Declan said, would go to where I grew up and find it insanely interesting, but it was deathly dull to me. But as I've grown older, I've become interested in actually thinking again about that.
Well, of course, there does come a point in everybody's life where they decide they want to do their family tree to find out where they came from. You know, so I think that's a sign either of old age or maturity or something. But I think you do become interested not so much in what you think and what your values are, but where do those thoughts and values really come from? You know, it can be quite a sort of self-analytic way of going, which, as I say, is full of richness and unexpected charm.
But also because you realise stories can come from anywhere. You know, it's that when you first start making books, stories are so difficult. You think, how am I possibly going to write something that no one else has written before? And it's really, really hard to come up with a plot, and it's really, really hard to do dialogue, and it's all so difficult. And the more you do, the more you realize, oh, I could do this, I could have done that, I could have done this. I mean, right now, I would say I've probably got 8 books worth of material that I'm never going to get to, because every other day I've got another idea for something, and I just file it along the other day. I've got thousands of ideas, you know. And the more you do, the more you realize, oh, I could do this, I could do that, I could do this. And so part of that feeds into what you want to make. You kind of think, well, if I can kind of make anything, then the things I want to make are things that are going to mean something, you know, to me and to other people. I don't just want to make stuff for the sake of making stuff, because the more stuff you make, the more you realize, you know, you can make whatever. So you want to make it more personal.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Rachel, do you have any desire to make a British comic, or is it just you just want to tell? Because I just want to tell stories. I'm happy to tell stories. It was until I got a certain age where I you know, these other ideas came. But is that something you want to do someday, or?
The problem is anything that's like that would be British, and you know, from my own experience, requires such a level of vulnerability that I'm not ready to explore yet. Because anytime you have to write something that's your own voice, it's so, I mean, not so much you, Declan, because you've written so much stuff, but for me, I'd feel so awkward, because everything, when I read it back, I'm hearing like 15-year-old me writing in a diary, just like, it's like, you know, I feel like every single person I try to writes in my voice, which is not a good voice to write in. So in short answer, I've tried. It was bad.
Fair enough. I'm fully confident you could totally do it if that's something you put your mind to.
I started to do a little autobiographical comic during lockdown, and the biggest hurdle I had was that I was drawing myself and my friends, and I sent it off, and my friends went, "How tall do you think you are?" Because I was like the same height as everyone else, and they were like, "Oh, baby, no."
Well, it's not about truth, it's about dramatic effect. Never forget that.
Thank you. And it's about as tall as I feel, so I'm 7 foot tall.
One thing that's come up in the conversation previously is about humour, and whether the British especially like to tell themselves that they are experts in sarcasm and irony, and nobody else gets it and nobody else really understands it. But the more I've travelled around the world, I realise everybody else thinks that about themselves as well, and that the British are idiots. I wonder what you all think about the role of humour as a kind of signal of where something is from. You see what I mean? Like in-jokes and the deployment of sarcasm and you know, humorous slang and things like that. Whether that's perhaps an easier way to identify where something is from by the creator's sense of humour.
I mean, a great example of that was I went to go see a talk by. Have anyone read the Asterix books?
Yeah, I love. That was my first comics.
So they're like incredibly well translated, because I can't remember her name. It was Mary something, the lady that was in charge of translating them. She would have to take like very French jokes that were about wording and then turn them into like English puns. So you realize that, like, yeah, if you there's some stuff that's universal, but that's, you know, that's France. So it's across the, you know, channel, but that's like a nearby example. Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know if this is, sorry, Dave.
I was going to say, what I think she very carefully did was maybe not do the same wordplay as the original French.
Yeah.
Make sure that there was the same amount of overall punnage.
Yeah.
You might lose a pun, but you find one a bit later. But I agree with you. That was wonderfully done. You know, and I mean, with something like Watchmen, which is very complex, sometimes the foreign editions have to have footnotes, because a lot of the wordplay is meaningless if English isn't your language. You know. But yeah, it's a weird thing with humour, because in a way, the humour that seems to be truly international is the kind of humour that doesn't really have words.
Yeah, I was reading somewhere, I don't know how true it is, so I could be totally wrong, but the reason a lot of humour that, say, coming from like a British, Irish perspective, a lot of humour, and maybe Mary would know more about this, but the humour does well in Europe tends to be more slapstick, more visual. That kind of, like, you know, more densely written stuff doesn't translate as well into other languages. But But I mean, with comics, you have the benefit of visuals, like that, like the Tintin Rasters, or all of that stuff does tend to be quite universal because you're looking at it. If you can tell what the story is, you get the joke.
Yeah, I mean, I remember starting in American comics that Americans used to say to me, "Oh, we just love British culture. We love your Monty Python." That they didn't truly get it. They thought it was strange and odd, but they didn't really get the humor of it. They just got the oddness of it. So sometimes oddness and weirdness can be the appeal of some material, not so much the fact that people actually find it funny or engaging. Discuss.
I also think there's a certain lack of sentimentality in English humour that is very present in American humour. If you compare some strips, like say, compare Peanuts to The Perishers, or compare American Dennis Menace to British Dennis Menace, and one of them, the American ones have this quite strong, strange sentimentality running through them, where people love each other, and they say so frequently, and they talk about their feelings a lot, and they're always, defining themselves by the things they love. Whereas American British comics are mostly about taking the piss out of everybody and everything in a way that doesn't allow for that.
It's a very strong element in British humour, and there is a basic kind of, see, this is a generalisation because I maybe don't know other cultures well enough to judge, but there's a distrust of authority in the British, and a desire to pull things down to your level rather than to aspire to be a millionaire with a Cadillac. You want to bring the millionaire with a Cadillac down to your level, and there's a lot of humour and a lot of pricking of pomposity in that, which I've always thought is a strong point in British humour, but that may well be so for other places.
Yeah, Mary, what's your perspective on this?
Well, for starters, I'm going to say that British humour is an actual thing that is considered to be like very refined by like Russians, like like there's this notion that British humour is especially clever. I do think it's more odd and strange, but it in some aspects it's definitely similar to like our humor. It's really hard to say because there's Giant Days, for example, the comic, and when you read it, you can definitely feel the Britishness of it, and it's hilariously funny. But I also struggle to put into words why that is.
Because I'm interested in the fact that the kind of comics that you could get hold of were basically Mickey Mouse, which it is one of those characters that has become universal around the world because it can be so straightforward in terms of comedy. Yeah, it can fit into any culture it appears in.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't care for Mickey Mouse as the character. I like Donald Duck because he was a complete failure, and that was kind of the appeal of the comics to me. I do think that both like English and Russian humor have this thing where it can be quite bleak, and it's all about betting on the underdog and stuff like that, and very like anti-authoritarian. It's hard for me to say how it translates into comics.
This might be even harder to ask Mary, but since she lives in Ireland, because I think there's a difference between, because I'm very much raised on British humour, we saw all the shows, but I think there is a more irreverent tone to the humour, our day-to-day humour, and like sometimes we would see British humour as very like, not British humour, but like, well, definitely British culture being up its own effectively, we definitely have it like, I don't want to say anti-British, but like, you guys were the big boys for a while and, not anymore kind of attitude, I think I said to Rachael before, like I'd never read any of her Doctor Who comics because Doctor Who is too British for me. But I wonder where the difference or where our humor, I just feel like our humor is a little bit more black than British, but I again, I'm biased, so I can't really tell.
So. I feel like there's more alcohol involved for sure.
How dare you? you might be right.
I mean, it's hard for me to tell.
Sure.
Because, yeah, I mean, I spent most of my time in Dublin just sitting at home with my cats, rather than talking to actual human beings.
Yeah, fair enough.
Ask me in a couple of years.
You got it.
I do remember reading, I can't remember where, a long time ago, that the greatest British joke was basically "You too will die," and that is the undercut.
The band?
I mean, maybe.
Bono will live forever, man.
We're coming to the end of the panel, but I wanted to ask how we see the perspective of comics changing, particularly with the internet, with, as we've talked about, so many more influences than just American culture or British culture being present in our minds. Whether any of you have seen or feel a gradual change in perspective. That stumped everybody, didn't it?
We're all waiting for someone else to go first.
Yeah.
Well, I would say, sorry, because I'll just keep talking. I think what's been really good in general is the diversification of content and format. Like outside of what the 22-page American comic or whatnot, but the web comic, the young adult graphic novel, the graphic novel, the novella, the 30-page one-shots. It just feels that I feel that the format has different formats kind of engage different levels of kind of inspiration and innovation, and that was so much harder to do when the industry was one thing for the large part. Like, say, for me, if I do a one-shot or graphic novel, the content changes or the story changes, and I think there's so many different types of way of delivering stories. I think that has been as important as the widening of, say, how less gatekeeping there is, like Mary was saying earlier.
Yeah, I think because of the internationalization of it, it's now like there are so many people from so many different backgrounds and approaches doing comics that somewhere out there's a flavor for everybody, and a chance to find unexpected flavors that you didn't know you wanted until you found them. So I feel very optimistic about the future of comics because, they always have been a thing that's really cheap to produce. It only takes time and minimal materials. And now that you can reach truly a global audience, this is only going to bring more and more interesting and diverse stuff out into the spotlight, I think.
Yeah, it was like earlier when you, Woodrow, said about like, oh no, I've paused. Oh no, I haven't. Sorry, my internet's been really buggy all day. So I was like, oh no, wrong time for that happened. But you said about a house style. And that's something we've really seen in like superhero books, where suddenly you've got artists from like Eastern Europe and East Asia, and they're bringing their sensibilities and their style into like superhero cape books and stuff. So even on that, like, I'm going to use mainstream, I'm really sorry, on the mainstream books, like a diversifying of that, like beyond just British and American into like all kinds of different stuff. And yeah, it's good.
Right.
Yeah, I find it really encouraging to go into a shop and not recognize anything, because there's nothing, I think, more kind of deadening, stultifying than people all trying to make something that looks the same because they think that's what sells. And what's exciting to me is to pick up a whole bunch of stuff that I don't know anything about, that I don't even like necessarily. It's really freeing not to have to like everything because it's a comic. It's like, yeah, I don't have to like this. There's all this stuff out here. I can like this bit and I can not like that bit, and that's fine because there's lots of it. And that's a great feeling.
Yeah, I was at a convention a while ago, and these people do a comic, like friends of mine. I won't say who, because I don't want to be a jerk, but I read their comic and I just wasn't really into it, to be honest. But it wasn't bad. It just wasn't really for me. But I was at a convention and like I saw this huge like queue for the book and for the creators, and I remember just thinking, it's not for me, but it is for them, and it doesn't matter if it's not for me. It doesn't have to be for me, not every film is for me, not every book is for me. But if we're in a case where we could have all these different stories and there's an audience that can support them, that's just a good thing.
Yeah, that's what makes it great now. It feels like, okay, we're actually starting to get somewhere as a medium when we can have such a plurality of voices that we don't have to love all of them because there's something for everybody. And so we've achieved something there, I think.
You know what? That is a perfect point to end on. Wonderful. So thank you, all of you, for taking part in this Thought Bubble panel. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Really great perspectives, and take care.